The helicopter had been sitting in the corner of the hangar for 3 years, maybe 4. Nobody kept exact count anymore, because nobody cared enough to. Rust had crept along its landing skids, the way ivy climbs an abandoned wall, slowly, patiently, as though it had all the time in the world to claim what no one else wanted. The rotor blades drooped at their tips. The fuselage bore a long diagonal scratch across its left flank, the kind that suggested a hard landing or a careless tow, and the windshield had gone milky with oxidation, so that standing in front of it, you saw only a vague outline of yourself, reflected back. Mechanics who passed through Sinclair Aviation's maintenance bay would occasionally glance at it the way people glance at a broken vending machine, not with irritation, not with curiosity, just with the quiet acknowledgement that some things are simply beyond repair. More than once, a junior technician had suggested cutting it apart for scrap, running the numbers on what the aluminum alone might fetch per pound. More than once, the idea had been filed away and forgotten. The helicopter had no obvious purpose. It occupied space, collected dust, and contributed nothing to a company already struggling to justify every square foot of its leased hangar. That company was Sinclair Aviation, and the woman who ran it was Victoria Sinclair, 38 years old, dark-haired, precise in the way that people who grew up without safety nets tend to be precise. She had taken over as CEO 4 years earlier after her predecessor left under circumstances that were described publicly as a mutual parting and privately as a controlled detonation. She had rebuilt the company's operational structure from the ground up, renegotiated 3 major contracts, and expanded the private charter fleet from 7 aircraft to 11. For 2 years, Sinclair Aviation had been quietly profitable, and Victoria had allowed herself, cautiously, to feel proud of that. Then the 3rd year came. Then, the 4th quarter of the 3rd year, which turned out to be the worst 3 months the company had seen since its founding. A major corporate client had dissolved their contract without warning when their parent company was acquired. A new competitor had undercut Sinclair's pricing on regional routes with a ferocity that felt almost personal. Fuel costs had spiked at exactly the wrong moment, right when the reserve cushion was thinnest. The board of directors, who had been patient through the lean months, were no longer patient. They scheduled meetings with the kind of frequency that meant they were preparing for something, and Victoria knew what they were preparing for, because she had seen it happen to other people. She arrived at every meeting fully composed and left every meeting running the numbers in her head again, looking for an angle she had missed. It was in this context, under pressure, short on options, and operating with the stripped-down pragmatism of someone who cannot afford sentiment, that Victoria Sinclair was walking through the maintenance bay on a Tuesday morning when she saw the man standing next to the old helicopter. He had let himself through the side entrance, which was technically a security violation, though the lock on that door had been temperamental for months, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. He was not tall, not particularly broad, dressed in dark work trousers and a plain jacket of the kind sold in bulk at hardware stores. He had the hands of someone who worked with them, not dirty, but marked, with the particular density in the knuckles that comes from years of handling metal and machinery. He was examining the helicopter's tail section with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the object he was examining, leaning close, tilting his head slightly to one side, as though listening to something the aircraft was trying to say. Victoria stopped about 10 feet away and said, evenly, "Can I help you?" It was the tone she used when what she meant was, "You should not be here, and I am giving you one opportunity to explain yourself before I make that explicit." The man straightened up and turned to face her. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that was not remarkable in any individual feature, but that added up, collectively, to something she could not immediately categorize. He looked at her the way people look at things they are trying to assess accurately, without performance, without the social veneer that most people apply automatically in unfamiliar situations. "I heard you might have some older aircraft available for sale," he said. His voice was unhurried. "I'm specifically interested in this one." He gestured toward the helicopter behind him, and Victoria studied him for a moment, recalibrating. Then, despite herself, she almost smiled. Almost. She told herself later that the offer of $222 was so far outside the range of what she expected that she genuinely did not process it correctly the first time. She asked him to repeat it. He did. $222. For a Bell helicopter that, even in its current condition, would require at minimum $12,000 in parts alone to bring to airworthy status, and that was before labor, before avionics, before the structural inspection that the FAA would require before anyone could legally lift it off the ground. She looked at him. He looked at her. He did not appear to be joking. And he did not appear to be confused. And he did not appear to be the kind of person who makes offers he has not thought through. Victoria Sinclair crossed her arms, tilted her head, and said, $222. He nodded. She said, "For that?" He nodded again. She almost laughed. She did not laugh, because she was a CEO in a difficult quarter, and she had not come this far by laughing at things she did not understand. But the amusement was there, warm and involuntary, rising behind her sternum. "Take it," she said finally. "You're buying a pile of scrap metal." The man thanked her, quietly and without ceremony, and she turned and walked back toward the office building, already thinking about the 11 things she needed to do before noon. His name was Ethan Carter, and he did not mince words when it came to paperwork. That was the first thing Victoria's office manager noted when she processed the transaction the following morning. The buyer had been meticulous about the documentation in a way that was unusual for a sale of this nature. Most people who bought salvage aircraft were either aviation hobbyists who wanted a project or parts dealers who wanted speed and minimal paperwork. Ethan Carter wanted neither speed nor minimal paperwork. He wanted the original ownership documents. He wanted the maintenance logs going back as far as they existed. He wanted the aircraft serial number cross-referenced against the registration history on file. Victoria's office manager had gone back through the filing cabinets twice and produced everything she could find, which amounted to a manila folder that was thinner than it should have been for an aircraft of that age. Several pages appeared to be missing, or had perhaps never been filed in the first place. Ethan had taken the folder, examined each page with the same focused patience he had brought to examining the aircraft itself, and said only that the documentation would be sufficient. He paid in cash $200 bills and a $22 addition in smaller notes, exact to the cent, and signed the transfer of ownership without hesitation. But before the ink was dry on the second page, he had asked Victoria directly, could he see the tail boom number plate? Not the registration plate on the nose, the secondary identification number stamped into the metal at the rear, the one that matched the manufacturer's internal build record rather than the FAA registration database. Victoria had not known that plate existed, and she did not say so. She led him back to the hangar, watched him crouch at the tail end of the helicopter with a small flashlight, and observed him staring at a sequence of characters stamped into the aluminum for nearly 2 full minutes without speaking. He took photographs not with a phone, but with a small, dedicated camera that he produced from his jacket pocket, the kind of device that suggested deliberate preparation. He photographed the plate from 3 angles, then he stood, thanked Victoria again, and asked when he could arrange transport. She told him by end of week. He said that would be fine. Before he left, he paused at the entrance to the hangar, turned back, and said something that Victoria found herself replaying several times in the days that followed. You just sold the most valuable thing in this building. She watched him walk to a modest truck in the parking lot. Not a luxury vehicle, not a work van with a company logo, just a plain dark truck of indeterminate age, and drive away. She stood in the hangar entrance for a moment afterward, looking at the space where the helicopter had been sitting for years, and felt, for the first time, something that was not quite certainty but was adjacent to it. The nagging, uncomfortable sense that she had missed something. Ethan Carter did not take the helicopter apart. This was the detail that filtered back to Victoria through her network of contacts over the following week. Delivered with the mild bewilderment of people reporting on behavior that did not fit any recognizable category. He had arranged for a flatbed transport. Had the aircraft loaded with professional care, not slung carelessly like salvage, but secured with the precision of someone moving something fragile and important, and had taken it to a private facility outside the city. A facility, it turned out, that was not a junkyard or a parts warehouse, but a restoration workshop. A serious one. Victoria heard this from a mechanic who knew someone who had worked at the facility briefly, and the description she received was of a workshop that dealt in rare and historically significant aircraft, the kind of operation that served museums, private collectors, and occasionally government agencies trying to recover pieces of their own history. The kind of operation, in other words, that had nothing to do with $200 purchases of forgotten helicopters from struggling aviation companies. Ethan had arrived at that workshop with two specific requests: a full structural assessment of the airframe and a preservation scan of every internal cavity. Not an exterior inspection, an internal one. He wanted every compartment, every panel, every space that could be accessed without damaging the aircraft, documented before anything else was touched. The lead technician at the workshop, a man who had been working on vintage aircraft for 30 years and had seen most things, later said that he had asked Ethan why, and Ethan had said only, "Because I think something was hidden in it a long time ago, and I don't want to miss it." The technician had proceeded on that basis, and within 48 hours of beginning the assessment, his team had confirmed what Ethan had suspected. There was a compartment in the helicopter that did not appear in any standard Bell schematic. It had been fabricated into the airframe with considerable skill, accessible through a panel behind the pilot's seat that was designed to look like a standard avionics access port, but opened. With the right sequence of pressure applied to the right points, into a space roughly the size of a large briefcase. It was empty, or it appeared empty, until the technician ran a light along the interior walls and found, adhered to the inner surface, with a strip of aged adhesive, a flat envelope made from heavy paper that had darkened with time, but had not deteriorated, protected by the sealed environment of the hidden space. The envelope contained 3 items: a folded topographic map with handwritten notations in ink that had faded to a pale brown, a bound set of technical documents, 47 pages, dense with specifications and diagrams, and a small leather journal, its pages compressed by time, filled with handwriting that was careful and precise, and unmistakably personal, the handwriting of someone who was recording things they did not expect to share, things they were writing down, because they needed to get them out of their own head and onto something they could look at. Ethan sat with these 3 items for a long time before he touched the journal. He had spent enough years working in this space, the space between lost things and the people who had owned them, to understand that documents like these were not simply information. They were the residue of a life, and they deserved a certain amount of quiet before anyone started extracting meaning from them. He put on clean gloves. He opened the journal to the first page. He read the name written there in that careful, compressed hand, and then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the workshop for a long moment, because the name he had just read was Richard Monroe. And that changed everything. Richard Monroe had been, 25 years ago, one of the most consequential figures in American aviation, not famous in the way that politicians or entertainers are famous, but known within the industry, with the kind of deep, specific recognition that comes from doing something genuinely important rather than merely visible. He had been an engineer first, then an entrepreneur, and then something harder to categorize. A man who operated at the intersection of military aviation development and private industry, brokering relationships and moving technologies between sectors in ways that were not always entirely transparent, but were almost always effective. He had also been, by all accounts, brilliant in the specific way that makes people simultaneously admirable and difficult, convinced of his own perceptions, impatient with people who could not keep up, and entirely unwilling to compromise on work he believed in. He had disappeared 25 years ago, during what his family and associates had described publicly as a routine personal flight, and the aircraft involved had never been recovered. The investigation had been thorough and had concluded nothing definitive. There were theories, most of them mundane: mechanical failure, pilot error, weather. But there had also been, among people who knew Monroe and knew what he had been working on in the months before he disappeared, a persistent and unsubstantiated belief that what happened was not an accident, that the timing was too convenient, that certain things Monroe had been developing, certain patents, certain proprietary designs that could have reshaped the economics of rotary wing aviation, had disappeared along with him, and that this was not a coincidence. Ethan Carter had known about Richard Monroe for most of his professional life. He had served for 8 years as an aerospace engineer with military assignments that took him into the territory where defense procurement and private innovation overlapped, And it was in that territory that Monroe's name came up repeatedly, not in official briefings, but in the margins of conversations, in the way that significant absences make themselves known. After leaving military service, Ethan had built a private recovery firm formerly named Carter Aerospace Recovery, and operating with a level of quiet professionalism that kept it off most people's radar while making it, among those who knew it, the premier organization for locating and authenticating lost aviation assets. He had spent the better part of a decade working cases that most investigators considered cold, finding things that the original searches had missed because they had been looking for aircraft when they should have been looking for the stories surrounding aircraft. He had been looking for the Monroe helicopter for 3 years. He had not told anyone outside his own small team that he was looking, because he had learned early that the moment you announce what you are searching for, the thing you are searching for tends to get harder to find. He had identified the Bell helicopter at Sinclair Aviation through a combination of research methods that were not glamorous cross-referencing manufacturer build records with FAA deregistration databases, tracking the chain of title on obscure aircraft that had passed through multiple owners under circumstances that were, on paper, unremarkable. The tail number had been changed at some point, and the original registration record had been altered in ways that were subtle enough to escape a casual review, but that Ethan had been trained to recognize. He had made the trip to Sinclair Aviation on a Tuesday morning because Tuesday mornings were statistically quiet in maintenance operations, and he had wanted to see the aircraft himself before making any approach to confirm what the documents suggested before committing to a course of action. What he saw in the hangar that morning confirmed it. The secondary identification stamp on the tail boom was original. It had not been changed, because changing it would have required grinding metal in a way that left marks, and whoever had modified the registration had apparently decided that was a risk not worth taking. Ethan had seen what he needed to see. He had made his offer, and Victoria Sinclair, pressed for time and unaware of what she was holding, had accepted it. The black convoy arrived at Sinclair Aviation on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the sale. Victoria was in the middle of a conference call with 2 board members when her assistant appeared in the doorway of her office with an expression that Victoria had learned, over 4 years, to take seriously, a controlled expression that her assistant used specifically when something was happening that fell outside the normal range of situations she had been prepared to handle. Victoria ended the call. She went to the window that overlooked the front entrance. There were 11 vehicles in the parking area, 4 black SUVs of the kind that private security firms favored, 2 sedans that bore the discrete markers of legal counsel, the particular shade of dark gray, the absence of any identifying markings, and 5 more vehicles that she could not immediately categorize, except as expensive and intentional. Men and women were emerging from these vehicles with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed the movement, or simply performed it so many times that it had become second nature. Some of them were clearly security. Some were clearly lawyers, carrying the particular kind of document cases that suggested they had brought paperwork that mattered, and walking from the lead SUV, moving without urgency, but with the absolute assurance of someone who has never needed to hurry because the world waits for him, was a man that Victoria recognized because his face appeared occasionally in the financial press and in the aerospace trade publications she read on Sunday mornings when she was trying to understand the landscape she was operating in. Alexander Monroe was 51 years old, the only son of Richard Monroe, and the current head of Monroe Holdings, a diversified portfolio that encompassed aerospace components, defense technology, and a collection of real estate and energy investments that together represented a net worth that financial analysts estimated, conservatively, at somewhere north of $4 billion. He was tall, with the kind of lean, angular build that suggested a man who slept well and ate carefully, and was comfortable with his own physical presence in a room. He wore a suit that was not flashy, but was clearly expensive in the way that only deeply expensive things can be, without being obvious about it. He walked into Sinclair Aviation's reception area as though he had always intended to be there, nodded to Victoria's assistant, and waited, standing, in the center of the room until Victoria came down from her office. She came down the stairs from the second floor and crossed the reception area and held out her hand, and he shook it with a firmness that was neither aggressive nor performative. Then he produced, from the interior pocket of his jacket, a folded check. He placed it on the reception desk between them. Victoria looked at it. The figure was $20 million. She looked up at Alexander Monroe and waited, because she had been in enough rooms with powerful people to know that when someone puts $20 million on a table, they do not need to explain why. "You let them speak first," he said. "The helicopter that was sold from this facility 3 days ago. Where is it now?" Victoria told him the truth, that she had sold the aircraft to a private buyer, and that she did not know its current location. Alexander Monroe's expression did not change in any way that could be described as dramatic. He simply considered what she had said for a moment, and then he said, "I need to find it, and I need your help to do that." He told her enough to understand what she was dealing with, that the helicopter had belonged to his father, that it contained documentation of significant value to his family, that he had been searching for it for a long time, and that the trail had led here. He did not tell her everything, but he told her enough, and what Victoria understood when he finished speaking was that the sale she had made 3 days ago, the transaction she had considered so trivial that she had barely registered the name of the buyer, had been, in ways she was only beginning to grasp, one of the most consequential decisions of her career. She started with the files. She went back through every piece of paper in the filing system that related to the helicopter. And she did it herself, rather than delegating it, because she had the specific feeling of a person who needs to understand exactly what happened before she can figure out what to do next. What she found over the course of 2 days of methodical searching was a pattern of small irregularities, documents that had been altered, pages that were missing from places where they should have existed, registration records that had been amended in ways that required knowledge and access to accomplish. The helicopter had not ended up in Sinclair Aviation's inventory by accident. Someone had placed it there, deliberately, under a false provenance, and had done so with enough care that the deception had survived for years without triggering any inquiry. The founder of Sinclair Aviation, Victoria's predecessor, the man who had started the company 2 decades ago and handed it off under those controlled circumstances, had known Richard Monroe. That much was clear from a reference in a letter she found in the archive. A personal letter rather than a business communication, written in a handwriting she recognized from signed documents in the company's founding records. She did not know yet what the nature of that relationship was, or what it meant for the helicopter's presence in the hangar, but she understood that the connection was not incidental. The board of directors, when they learned the outlines of the situation, which they did through the particular corporate information osmosis that Victoria had never quite been able to contain, reacted in the way that boards react when they sense legal exposure. They wanted to call lawyers. They wanted to issue a formal claim on the aircraft. They wanted to establish that any intellectual property or assets that had passed through Sinclair Aviation's facility constituted a legitimate interest of the company. Victoria listened to these suggestions in the next board meeting with the full, careful attention she always brought to these sessions, and then she said that before any legal action was taken, she wanted to speak directly to the buyer. The board's legal counsel said that was not advisable. Victoria said she understood their concern and that she was going to do it anyway. She adjourned the meeting, went back to her office, and started making calls. It took her 4 days to find Ethan Carter, which was itself informative, because 4 days is a long time in an age when most people can be located in 4 minutes. He had not hidden himself in any dramatic way. His name was attached to a company, Carter Aerospace Recovery, that had a registered address and a brief, sparse website that listed its services without photographs or case studies or any of the social markers that most businesses use to establish credibility. It was the website of an operation that did not need to advertise because it did not lack for clients. Victoria drove to the address on a Monday morning and found a building that was modest from the outside, and, when she was escorted inside by a young woman who seemed unsurprised by her appearance, considerably more sophisticated than its exterior suggested. The walls of the main workspace held framed technical drawings and photographs of aircraft in various states of restoration, not decorative, but documentary, the record of a practice. Ethan was at a workbench in the back, studying a set of documents under a high-powered lamp, and he looked up when she came in with the same absence of performance she had noted the first time she met him. She told him she wanted to buy the helicopter back. He said no. She told him she could go significantly above the purchase price. She named a number that was, under the circumstances, a reasonable opening offer, and that she expected to negotiate from. He said the price was not the issue. She asked what the issue was, and he said, simply and without apparent interest in making her feel the weight of it, "It's not mine to sell back to you." She stared at him for a moment across the workbench. "You bought it," she said. He said, "I bought the right to find what was inside it. The helicopter belongs to someone else." He had known, since he first opened the hidden compartment and read the name in the journal, exactly what he was going to do. He had not known when Victoria would show up, but he had not doubted that she would. He looked at her across the table, with the attention of someone who is interested in people as problems to be understood rather than obstacles to be managed, and he told her what he had found. Not all of it, not the specific contents of the documents, but enough for her to understand the shape of what had happened and why it mattered. He had been, he told her, an aerospace engineer with military background and a subsequent decade in private recovery work. He explained Carter Aerospace Recovery in the same minimal way that his website did what it did, how it operated, what kinds of cases it took. He said he had been tracking the Monroe helicopter for 3 years. He said the tail number alteration had been the key, that whoever had hidden the aircraft had been careful about most things but had miscalculated on the secondary stamp, probably because they had not anticipated that anyone would know to look for it. He said that he had not known, when he walked into Sinclair Aviation's maintenance bay, exactly what was inside the aircraft. He had known there was likely something significant, based on what he knew of Monroe and of the circumstances of the helicopter's disappearance, but he had not confirmed it until the restoration team opened the hidden compartment. Victoria listened to all of this with the focused silence she brought to important information. When he finished, she said, "You told me I'd sold the most valuable thing in the building." He said yes. She said, "You knew then?" He said, "I was confident." There was a pause. She said, "Why $222? He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, and said, "It was the number that appeared on the tail stamp. I thought it was appropriate." The documents in the hidden compartment were, ultimately, not a map to buried treasure in the traditional sense. They were something less cinematic and considerably more consequential. The technical documents, the 47 pages of specifications and diagrams, were the original design records for a proprietary variable pitch rotor system that Richard Monroe had developed in the early years of his company, before the work had been formalized into patents and before the patents had been filed. They represented the foundational intellectual property for a technology that subsequent manufacturers had developed independently over the following 2 decades, and that was currently embedded in a substantial percentage of commercial and military rotary wing aircraft worldwide. The question of whether those subsequent developments had been truly independent, or whether Monroe's original designs had been accessed without authorization during the years when the helicopter and its hidden contents were missing, was a question that lawyers and engineers were going to spend a considerable amount of time working through. But the baseline fact that here were the original documents, dated and signed and technically specific, gave Monroe Holdings a position in that conversation that they had not previously possessed. The journal was a separate matter entirely. Where the technical documents were precise and formal, the language of engineering, of measurement and specification, the journal was personal in a way that no legal argument could fully account for. Richard Monroe had written in it over a period of several months, recording not just the technical progress of his work but the texture of the days surrounding it. The meetings that had gone badly, the investors who had not understood what he was building, the late nights when he had gone back to the workshop alone, because being alone with the problem was the only way he knew to solve it. He wrote about his son, Alexander, who would have been in his mid-20s when the final entries were made, with a particular kind of restrained tenderness, the tenderness of a man who expressed love through planning rather than declaration, through the arrangements he was trying to make to ensure that what he had built would survive him in whatever form his survival took. One entry, near the end of the journal, read, "The work is more important than who gets credit for it, but the credit matters for Alexander. He needs to be able to stand on what I built." That one sentence, Ethan thought when he read it, explained the hidden compartment as completely as any investigation could. Richard Monroe had not hidden the documents to protect himself. He had hidden them to protect his son, to ensure that if something happened to him, there would be a record that could not be disputed, stored somewhere that only someone determined and knowledgeable would think to look. He had not, apparently, anticipated that it would take 25 years for that person to arrive. But he had been right about everything else. Alexander Monroe, when Ethan contacted him directly and arranged to return the documents, arrived at the restoration workshop with a smaller entourage than he had brought to Sinclair Aviation. Just 2 lawyers and 1 technical expert. The expert presumably to verify authenticity of the documents before anything was signed. He spent 2 hours with the technical expert going through the 47 pages in silence, occasionally asking questions that Ethan answered, and occasionally writing notes that he did not share. At the end of 2 hours, he closed the folder, looked at Ethan, and said, "You could have sold these." Ethan said, "Yes." Alexander said, "To competitors, to anyone who wanted leverage over us." Ethan said, "Yes." Alexander said, "Why didn't you?" Ethan said he had never considered it. He said that what Monroe Holdings had lost 25 years ago was not just documents, it was the record of something a man had built, and that man's son had been living with the absence of that record for his entire adult life. He said that returning it was the only outcome that made sense to him. Alexander Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Name your price." Ethan said there was no price. Alexander said he would not accept that. Ethan said that was Alexander's choice to make, but that his answer was not going to change. The lawyers on both sides of the table shifted in their chairs with the particular discomfort of legal professionals watching a negotiation proceed in a way they had not prepared for. Victoria Sinclair had been present for this conversation, seated near the back of the room, because Ethan had invited her and because she had come. She was there as an observer. She had no claim on the documents, no formal standing in the transaction, but Ethan had invited her specifically, and she had understood, arriving, that this was intentional. He wanted her to see how this ended. She watched Alexander Monroe extend a $20 million offer, and watched Ethan decline it with the same undramatic certainty that he brought to everything, and she felt something shift inside her that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. She had spent her career in rooms where money was the primary language, where everything eventually resolved into a number that both parties could live with, where the question was always some variation of what is this worth and how do we split it. She had become fluent in that language, and she was, by any honest accounting, good at it. But she had also, somewhere in the process of becoming good at it, stopped being able to imagine that people operated outside of it. That some people found the offer itself to be a misunderstanding of what had happened. Watching Ethan decline $20 million with the polite but absolute finality of a man who has never needed to prove anything to anyone, Victoria Sinclair felt the particular disorientation of a sophisticated person encountering a principle they had theoretically understood but never actually witnessed in practice. Alexander Monroe, to his credit, did not press. He accepted the refusal with more grace than Victoria expected from a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he shifted his attention to what he could offer, rather than what Ethan would not take. What he proposed, over the following 2 weeks of conversations that were conducted with increasing warmth and decreasing formality, was a partnership. Monroe Holdings had capital and market access, and a name that carried weight in the aerospace industry. Carter Aerospace Recovery had expertise and credibility in a specialized field, and as the events of the preceding weeks had demonstrated a capacity for locating and authenticating assets that no amount of money alone could replicate. Sinclair Aviation, which had not been part of Alexander's original calculation, but which had been present throughout, and which had, in Victoria, a CEO whose intelligence and adaptability had become increasingly apparent over the course of the negotiations, had operational infrastructure and licensing, and a fleet that could serve as the practical foundation for a new entity. Alexander proposed a 3-way partnership. A new aerospace holding company that would combine Monroe Holdings' resources, Carter's technical expertise, and Sinclair Aviation's operational base. Victoria would run the new company's operations. Ethan would lead its recovery and authentication division, which Monroe planned to expand significantly. The Monroe family patents, both the original ones that had always been filed and the new claims that the recovered documents would support, would form the foundation of the entity's intellectual property portfolio. Victoria asked for 48 hours to think about it. She did not need 48 hours. She needed the 48 hours to be able to say honestly that she had taken time and had not simply reacted in the moment, which was the kind of discipline she had imposed on herself after a decision made too quickly in the third year had contributed to the problems of the fourth quarter. She spent those 48 hours examining the proposal from every angle she could find, asking the questions she was trained to ask. Where are the risks? Where are the assumptions? What happens if the patent claims are weaker than expected? What is the exit scenario? Who has control, and under what conditions? The answers were, individually, reasonable. Together, they added up to something better than reasonable, something she could not have designed on her own because it required the intersection of three things that had not been, until a few weeks ago, in any kind of relationship with each other. Victoria agreed, and she said yes, with a clarity and speed that surprised even herself, because she had spent 4 years making decisions that required long analysis and careful hedging, and this felt, by contrast, obvious. She knew, the moment the proposal was complete, that it was the right answer. Not just financially, though financially it was transformative. A lifeline that Sinclair Aviation had not had any reasonable hope of finding a month ago, but structurally, it was the right combination of the right things in the right proportions, built around an event that had been, from a certain angle, absurd. A $222 transaction that a distracted CEO had signed off on while thinking about 11 other things. 6 months passed in the way that months pass when serious work is being done, quickly. And without much of the drama that had characterized the weeks preceding them, Sinclair Aviation's rebranding into the operational arm of the new holding company formally incorporated as Monroe Carter Aerospace Partners was handled with the kind of efficient professionalism that all three parties brought to the work. The board of directors, who had wanted to sue Ethan Carter, and who had been deeply skeptical of the proposed partnership when Victoria first presented it, came around when the first term sheet arrived with Monroe Holdings' signature on it. People tend to come around when the numbers are compelling enough. The new company's stock offering was oversubscribed within 48 hours of its announcement, driven partly by the announcement of the recovered patents, and partly by the broader market's recognition that Monroe Holdings' entry into the operational aviation space was a signal worth paying attention to. Victoria's picture appeared on the cover of an aerospace trade publication in the 5th month, in a feature about the restructuring. She had been on trade publication covers before, but this one felt different. In the photograph, she was standing on the tarmac outside the company's expanded hangar facility, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that was recognizably hers, direct, composed, a little guarded, but that had something in it that earlier photographs had not. Some quality of settledness, as though she was exactly where she had decided to be. There were harder days in those 6 months, because there always are. There were patent attorneys who disagreed with each other about the strength of Monroe's claim and the scope of the damages argument. There were legacy employees at Sinclair Aviation who had been there for a decade and who did not receive the news of the restructuring with the enthusiasm the leadership had hoped for, and who required the kind of patient individual conversation that Victoria was not, by temperament, inclined to have, but that she had, by this point in her leadership, learned was non-negotiable. There was a regulatory review of the patent recovery process itself that required 4 months of documentation, submission, and 2 in-person hearings before an administrative board that moved at a geological pace. And there was the quiet, ongoing work of building a working relationship between 3 parties who had come from very different places and who were learning, with varying degrees of comfort, to trust each other's judgment on the decisions that fell within each other's domain. Victoria led operations. Ethan led technical recovery. Alexander provided the capital and the strategic direction, and, more than either of those things, the patience of a man who had been waiting 25 years for a resolution to something, and who understood, therefore, what it meant to wait for good outcomes rather than demanding fast ones. It was not a seamless process, but it was, consistently, a process of people who were trying to do the right thing, which is rarer than it should be, and makes most other problems solvable. The helicopter was restored. Ethan's team worked on it over the same 6 months, quietly and methodically, in the space between the larger demands of the partnership formation. It was a painstaking process. The Bell airframe required parts that had to be sourced from specialist suppliers, and several components had to be fabricated from scratch by craftsmen who still worked in the old ways. The hidden compartment was sealed again, empty now, its contents safe in Monroe Holdings' archive. The fuselage was refinished in a deep midnight blue that had not been the original color but that Ethan had chosen after a conversation with Alexander about what his father had favored aesthetically. The rotor blades were balanced to a tolerance that exceeded original factory specifications. The windshield was replaced with optically pure glass. When the restoration was complete, the helicopter looked, as one of the technicians said, like something that had decided to be new again. It sat on the tarmac in the early evening light, and was, objectively, beautiful. Victoria stood on that tarmac on a Thursday evening in the late autumn, with the sun going down over the western edge of the airfield, painting the sky in the gradated oranges and pinks that aviation people tend to accumulate a particular appreciation for, given how much time they spend looking at the sky from different angles. Ethan was standing beside her. They had developed, over the 6 months of the partnership, the kind of working relationship that is built on genuine mutual regard, the recognition, on each side, of something in the other that is worth paying attention to. Victoria had told him once, in a conversation about a strategic question that had extended longer than either of them expected, that she found it difficult to trust people who were easy to read, because in her experience, easy-to-read people were usually performing rather than being. Ethan had said he understood that, and that he found it difficult to trust people who could not admit what they didn't know. Because in his experience, certainty in the absence of information was usually fear pretending to be competence. They had looked at each other for a moment, after that exchange, and then moved on to the strategic question, but something had been said. Victoria was not a person who made confessions easily, and she chose this moment on the tarmac because it was quiet, and because the setting had the particular quality of an ending that is also a beginning, and because she had found, in Ethan's company, that honesty came less expensively than it usually did. She said, "The day you came in and offered me $222 for that helicopter, I thought you were either delusional or running some kind of long con that I wasn't smart enough to see yet." He looked at the helicopter. He said, "And I thought you were a CEO who was running faster than she could see." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that same particular attention she had noticed the first time, the attention of someone who finds other people genuinely interesting rather than instrumentally useful. She said, "Were you right?" He said, "About the running fast part? Probably. The rest of it was a CEO who built something real and was trying to protect it." She was quiet for a moment. The light was changing, the sky deepening. She said, "You know, I had 11 items on my to-do list the morning you walked in." He said, "And the helicopter wasn't one of them." She said, "The helicopter was not one of them." He said, "It's a good thing I didn't know that." She smiled, a real one. Not the composed professional version that she deployed in board meetings and press appearances, but the slightly off-balance smile of a person who has been caught off guard by their own amusement. She said, "Maybe the $222 deal was the best decision I've ever made." He looked at her. He said, "You didn't make it. I did." She said, "I accepted it." He said, "Fair enough." The helicopter's engine turned over with a sound that was deep and mechanical, and entirely healthy, the sound of something that had been dead and was now alive, or perhaps more accurately the sound of something that had never been finished and now was. It lifted from the tarmac with the particular grace of rotary wing flight, which is not the elegant arc of a fixed-wing aircraft but something more deliberate and more vertical, a machine committing to its own ascent with full attention. Victoria watched it rise against the darkening sky, and she felt, in the way that important moments sometimes deliver their meaning directly rather than requiring interpretation, that she was watching something that was simultaneously an ending and a prologue. The man standing beside her had paid $222 for a rusted helicopter, and had found in it the documentation of a generation's worth of missing work, and had given it back to the family it belonged to without asking for anything in return, and had in doing so set into motion a chain of events that had rebuilt a struggling company, recovered a technological legacy, and produced something that did not yet have a name, but that both of them understood was present and significant. She did not say any of that. She watched the helicopter become a shape against the evening sky, and then a smaller shape, and then a point of light moving steadily north. And she thought that some things do not need to be said, because they are already understood by the people who need to understand them. There are moments in a life, if you are attentive enough, or perhaps just fortunate enough, or perhaps both, when you recognize in real time that something important is happening, rather than understanding it only in retrospect. Victoria Sinclair had spent most of her professional life operating in retrospect, making sense of what had occurred after the fact, extracting the lesson and filing it away and moving forward. She was good at that. She was considerably less practiced at standing in the moment and letting it be what it was without immediately reaching for what came next. But the tarmac was quiet, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light. And the man beside her was looking at the horizon with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and for once, she did not reach. She stood in it. She let the moment be exactly what it was, an ending and a beginning, and a Thursday evening in late autumn and a helicopter rising into the dark, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has finally stopped running faster than she can see, that the most valuable things are rarely the ones that anyone thought to protect.